She was his aunt. He was her nephew. Their marriage, sealed by papal decree, bound blood too tightly. In the halls of power, it was called strategy. In whispers, it was called something else. Catherine of Austria became Queen of Portugal, not by choice, but by design. And from that union, only silence and sorrow endured. She was born in a palace where no one married for love. In 1507, under the shadow of Europe's most powerful dynasty, Catherine of Austria entered the world not as a child, but as a thread in a tapestry already knotted by blood. She was the daughter of Philip the Handsome, the charming son of the Holy Roman Emperor, and Joanna of Castile, a queen who would one day be locked away for speaking to ghosts. And though Catherine herself was born of royalty, she would spend her entire life learning that royalty did not always mean freedom. Her blood was gold, but also poisoned. The Habsburg family, to which she belonged, believed in marrying within their own bloodline to protect the empire. Over generations, cousins wed cousins, uncles took nieces, and children were born into a lineage so tightly coiled it could no longer breathe without breaking something inside. Catherine's family tree didn't branch, it looped. She was the youngest daughter in a line of 7 children. Her older brother was Charles, soon to be Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and one of the most powerful men the continent had ever seen. Another sister, Eleanor, would become Queen of France. A third, Mary, would rule Hungary and Bohemia. Each one, like Catherine, was born to serve the empire, not to shape their own destinies. Her father died when she was barely a year old. Her mother, unraveling with grief and paranoia, was declared mentally unfit to rule. Catherine never knew a mother's lullaby or a father's hand. She knew tutors, governesses, confessional booths, and political whispers. She was raised in Mechlin, in the Low Countries, under the care of her Aunt Margaret of Austria, one of the few women of her family who had ruled with strength and dignity. Under Margaret's strict and intellectual guidance, Catherine learned Latin, philosophy, theology, and the expectations placed on a girl whose name alone could spark alliances or wars. She was not educated for wonder. She was trained for obedience. At court, she was seen not as a girl, but as a vessel of diplomacy. Her features were inspected, her posture corrected, her words measured. Everything she did reflected on the Habsburgs, and the Habsburgs demanded perfection, even in sorrow, especially in silence. By the age of 15, Catherine was already the subject of marital negotiations. Her name had passed across tables in France, the German principalities, and the Italian states. Suitors were considered not for compatibility, but for strategic gain. She knew she would be married to a man she'd never chosen. That was the only certainty a Habsburg princess ever had. But no match came, not yet. While her sisters were sent off one by one to royal courts across Europe, Catherine remained behind. Perhaps her quiet nature made her less desirable. Perhaps her family was saving her for something bigger. Or perhaps they were waiting for the right crisis. Because in the world Catherine was born into, a marriage was never just a union. It was a solution, a transaction, a weapon. The world she lived in was one of candlelight diplomacy and ink-stained compromise. Every letter written by her brother Charles was part prayer, part chess move. Every treaty signed by her grandfather Maximilian was lined with the blood of cousins. And Catherine, silent, modest, dutiful Catherine, waited for her turn to be used. But no one asked if she was ready. They didn't ask what she wanted. They never did. In portraits of the time, Catherine's eyes are always distant. She wears the dark velvets and rigid collars of Spanish court fashion, her hands folded, her expression neutral. But if you look closely, if you stare long enough, you can sense the weight behind her composure, the tension beneath the silk, the unspoken fact that she was not just born into a royal family. She was born into its trap. Her world was made of marbled corridors and whispering chapels. Her days began with Mass and ended with letters from people she would never meet. She learned to pray, not for salvation, but for patience. She was taught that women did not shape nations. They birthed them, they stabilized them, and they did so quietly. The empire didn't want Catherine to speak. It wanted her to marry. And it would find a husband for her in the most unsettling place imaginable. Portugal had a king, young, devout, hesitant. His name was John III, and he was Catherine's nephew. A few raised their eyebrows. Some muttered behind their hands, but no one stopped the negotiations, because Catherine was not a woman, not to them. She was an answer, a bridge, a necessary compromise. And so her future was set into motion. Not by a proposal, but by a contract sent between monarchs. Soon, Catherine would leave the court that had raised her, the siblings who had ignored her, and the aunt who had protected her. She would step into a new role, into a new kingdom, into a marriage that was not only political, but biological. And the silence that had been her childhood would follow her there. It always did. The year was 1525, and Europe held its breath. Portugal, small but powerful, rich from spice and ocean wind, needed an heir, and quickly. King John III had ruled for 4 years, but the shadow of mortality loomed large over every monarchy. Without an heir, all thrones tremble, all borders bleed. His ministers whispered of danger, not from war, but from within. A childless king was an invitation to rebellion, to civil unrest, to foreign hands reaching across the Pyrenees. And so, the court began its calculations. The solution must be pure, strategic, unbreakable. It had to be a Habsburg. The bride they chose was not a stranger, not a foreign duchess or a distant cousin of a rival house. She was family, so close in blood that the match itself bordered on the grotesque. They chose Catherine. She was his aunt. He was her sister's son. It was not the first time a Habsburg marriage twisted the rules of nature, but it was among the most intimate. The union, though unsettling to many, was rendered legitimate by the highest authority in Christendom. The Pope himself, Clement VII, issued a dispensation that turned what was once sin into sacrament. And thus, Catherine was summoned. She packed no trousseau of lace and laughter, only relics, missals, veils, and duty, always duty. The voyage from Castile to Lisbon was not long in distance, but immeasurable in consequence. She crossed rivers and borders not merely to change residence, but to bind 2 crowns in blood that was already shared. When she arrived, the city greeted her with ceremony, bells, silks, and solemn cheers. But behind the fanfare was unease. The people bowed, but they stared too. They knew. Everyone knew. This was not a love story. It was a solution. The wedding was held in the royal chapel. Gold glinted in every candle. Incense masked the tension. Latin prayers filled the vaulted ceiling, but they could not erase the murmurs below. They stood together, Catherine and John, not with joy, but with gravity. she in her 20s, he not yet out of adolescence. They barely exchanged words. They would exchange so much more. From that day forward, Catherine was Queen of Portugal. But what does it mean to be queen when the crown sits on your nephew's head and your marriage license is written in papal absolution? In public, she played the part with precision. Her manners were faultless, her piety unquestioned. She knelt before the altar and rose with poise. She visited hospitals, sponsored convents, and memorized the rhythm of court rituals that were not hers by birth. But she was not Portuguese, and she never would be. The court spoke a different language, not just in words, but in expectations. Her Castilian gravity seemed cold to a people accustomed to warmth. Her Spanish discipline, a veil that obscured emotion, was read as arrogance. The queen consort walked among courtiers who smiled but never embraced. She dined at tables where she was honored but rarely understood. She spoke, and the room listened, but never leaned closer. Even in power, she remained foreign. And yet, she did what queens were meant to do. She bore children. Her first pregnancy was met with celebration, a procession, fountains of wine, prayers sung from towers. The entire kingdom held its breath for a healthy boy. It ended in silence. So did the next, and the next. But she did not cry in public. She never allowed herself the indulgence of visible grief. Queens were not women. They were symbols, and symbols do not break. Behind embroidered drapes and high-backed chairs, she mourned alone. John III, ever devout, ever restrained, gave no great comfort. He was a king consumed by theology and empire, a man whose thoughts were often in Rome or India, but rarely beside the woman who shared his throne. They were united in purpose, not in passion. He respected her. He deferred to her piety, her counsel, her silence. But in portraits, they never touch. Their hands rest on the same table, but never near each other. The marriage produced heirs, but not joy. Catherine's life became a loop of ceremonial appearances, childbirth, and quiet retreat. She spent hours in the royal chapel, where stone saints bore expressions as unreadable as her own. The people came to accept her. Some even admired her austerity. But few loved her. She did not dance at court festivals. She did not hunt. She did not gossip. She endured. And all the while, the whispers never stopped. Not among peasants, not among bishops, not among visiting ambassadors. They whispered about the blood. "Aunt and nephew," they said, behind tapestries and between sips of wine. Too close. The church had blessed it. The law had permitted it. But nature had not. The union was sacred, yes, but it was also cursed. Each child they conceived bore the mark, not on the skin, but in the breath, in the bones, in the fragility that crept like a shadow into every cradle. And Catherine, though she never said it, must have felt it, that she had been given a crown, but also a sentence. That her womb had become a ledger of imperial decline. That she was the queen not of triumph, but of slow unraveling. And still, she did not rebel. She did not complain. She never looked back towards Spain and asked for rescue. She stayed. She served. She knelt when asked. She stood when summoned. She was a queen, a wife, an aunt. But most of all, she was an echo of a family so entangled in itself that it could no longer distinguish between love and obligation, between kinship and sacrifice. And in that echo, Catherine lived and learned to be silent. The crown sat evenly on her head, but it weighed differently in her mind. To the world, she was queen, a consort beside a pious king, a mother-to-be, a symbol of Habsburg Spanish-Portuguese unity. Yet beneath the veils, beneath the ceremonial silks and layers of gold-threaded fabric, Catherine was something else entirely. A woman caught between two monarchies, two dynasties, and too many ghosts in the room. She did not sleep easily. Her days began with mass. Her nights ended in silence. The rituals of court life moved around her like a clockwork machine she had been wound into. Meals were scheduled, appearances rehearsed, every word measured before it left her lips. She rarely laughed. She never danced. She fulfilled expectations with the quiet precision of someone who understood that love, in her position, was neither possible nor necessary. In public, she walked 2 steps behind her husband, but in private, they walked side by side, though rarely together. John III was not unkind. He was not cruel. He spoke to her with respect, consulted her on matters of faith and family. But affection between them was ceremonial, distant, almost theoretical. They dined across long tables, knelt at altars side by side. But their hands never reached for each other beneath the cloth. Their marriage, while free of scandal, was also free of warmth. He governed with solemnity. She governed herself. And in that cold space between formality and affection, Catherine built a life of restraint. She learned to find comfort not in her husband's words, but in the liturgy. She found purpose in patronage, commissioning churches and supporting monasteries with quiet generosity. She embroidered, prayed, and kept diaries no one would ever read. She carried children, then buried them, again and again. She conceived often. The physicians rejoiced. The court celebrated. Bells rang from towers. Yet for all the trumpets that heralded new life, few survived to hear their echoes. Some were stillborn. Some died within days, their cries fading into silence before names were even spoken aloud. Others lived longer, but never long enough. 9 children, 9 candles snuffed before their time. Each one left a hollow, not just in the nursery, but in her soul. She wore black more often than any other color. She withdrew from festivities. Each pregnancy was met not with joy, but dread. An unspoken fear that the child she bore would be too fragile, too pale, too doomed from the start. The court whispered in guarded tones. They blamed the blood. Not just her blood, but their shared blood. The union of aunt and nephew had been legal. It had been blessed by the Pope. But the bodies of their children did not honor the blessing. They collapsed under it. The nobles began to look elsewhere for strength. Some blamed Catherine, in hushed voices and cautious glances, for being too foreign. Others muttered about divine punishment, about the sins of bloodlines folded too tightly. And yet, she never responded. She never wrote to her brother Charles V to complain. She never publicly grieved, never shouted, never begged. She bowed her head. She walked through palace halls with eyes lowered. She lit candles not for show, but for memory. Her son, Prince João Manuel, lived, but only just. He was delicate from birth, his breath shallow, his frame thin, his smile rarely seen. Physicians hovered around him like shadows. Every cough stirred panic. Every fever was a storm. Catherine watched over him like a relic herself, terrified, tender, but prepared for loss. She had buried too many to believe in permanence. João was her hope, the last flickering one. She devoted herself to him with a quiet fierceness. She supervised his education, guarded his health, chose his companions with care. When he reached adolescence, he was betrothed to Joan of Spain, his cousin, another thread from the same twisted loom of royal blood. It was an alliance designed to protect the Habsburg inheritance. It would continue the line. It would tie Spain and Portugal in bonds even ink could not undo. But Catherine watched them with an ache she didn't name. She saw in their union not promise, but repetition, history folding into itself. Another circle forming. João married. Joan bore him a son, and then João died. The cause was consumption, they said. His lungs, weak from childhood, had failed him. He died before he could inherit the throne, before he could raise a son, before Catherine could finally rest. Her grief was not loud. It didn't scream through corridors or shatter porcelain. It sat in her spine, in her eyes, in the way she held her rosary for hours without moving. She did not speak of it, but she carried it in every breath, in every silence. Her grandson, Sebastian, was now the heir. A child born of cousins, crowned by cradle, not by choice. The line would continue, but it trembled. And Catherine, who had given her body to empire, who had buried her children and silenced her heart, found herself caught between two thrones, one that had never truly accepted her, and another that only called upon her when needed. She was too Spanish for Lisbon, too Portuguese for Madrid. To Charles V, she was a valuable bridge. To John III, she was an obedient wife. To history, she was nearly invisible. But Catherine never vanished. She was there, always, in the background of portraits, in the margins of letters, in the shadows of royal ceremonies. She stood behind the thrones, beside the coffins, beneath the domes of cathedrals, echoing with requiems sung for the sons she could not save. Her marriage was not a failure, but it was a wound that never closed. A mother buries one child and learns how grief folds itself into ritual. A mother buries two, and silence becomes instinct. But Catherine of Austria buried seven children, each born with expectation and named in hope. 7 cradles built in joy, later taken apart in mourning. 7 processions, some grand, others hurried, moved through palace corridors draped in black. She had become not only a queen, but a vessel of dynastic despair. It began innocently, as it always does, with celebration. Each pregnancy announced with banners, bells, and proclamations. The church offered masses. Courtiers offered congratulations. The people cheered in the streets of Lisbon, unaware that behind the palace gates, anxiety outweighed joy. Because by then, the pattern had already begun to set. Catherine's firstborn died shortly after birth. A boy, unnamed. His face was never painted. His cry barely heard. Then came a daughter, Maria Manuela, who survived childhood and was married to Prince Philip of Spain, only to die at age 17 after giving birth to a stillborn child. Then another daughter, who never drew breath. A boy after that, who lived 4 months. The cycle continued, as though fate itself were determined to test the endurance of a mother who never questioned her duty. Catherine carried 9 children. Only 2 lived beyond infancy. And even those, Maria and João, carried frailty like a shadow stitched into their skin. She stopped asking why. In the Portuguese court, her tragedies became whispers woven into the fabric of daily life. Nobles spoke in low voices about divine punishment. Clergy muttered about the consequences of consanguinity. Physicians offered explanations with trembling hands. Poor humors, inherited illness, melancholia, the mysterious workings of the womb. But no one could deny what lingered behind each death: the bloodline itself. Habsburgs married each other. It was tradition. Politics made it necessary. The purity of the dynasty demanded it. But purity has a price. By the mid-16th century, that price began to reveal itself, not in scandal, but in sickness. Not in rebellion, but in bones too soft to stand, lungs too thin to breathe, hearts too weak to last. Catherine had known this truth since girlhood. She had seen the madness in her mother, Joanna of Castile. She had watched her brother Charles V tremble from gout and seizures. She had understood, without ever being told, that something in their lineage did not bend. It broke. And yet she continued. Not out of ignorance, but out of obligation. Because queens do not question blood. They continue it. João Manuel, her only surviving son, became the last hope not just for her heart, but for 2 crowns. He was pale, almost translucent. He read for hours, loved music, preferred cloisters to courts. His tutors adored him. His doctors feared for him. He suffered from fatigue that no sleep could fix. Nosebleeds that arrived without warning. Fevers that left him breathless. Catherine watched him grow, and with each passing year, she grew quieter. She supervised his education personally. She approved every appointment to his household. She refused to allow him to ride horses too often, to hunt, to stay out late, to walk without a servant watching his every step. João was 17 when he married Joan of Spain. She was his cousin, the daughter of Emperor Charles V. The union was meant to solidify Iberian ties, to preserve the Habsburg inheritance, to keep the empire intact through one single line of descent. Joan was young but devout, raised in the Spanish court, trained in silence like Catherine had been. The wedding was modest but solemn, and the entire palace exhaled when Joan became pregnant just months later. Catherine dared to hope. Perhaps this time the story would change. Perhaps the union of cousins would not repeat the agony she knew so well. But God, or fate, was not finished. João died before the child was born. Tuberculosis, the doctor said. A wasting illness. His lungs collapsed. His body failed. He died in agony, bleeding into linen embroidered with his mother's own monogram. They buried him in the monastery of Jerónimos, the same place where Catherine had once prayed for strength during her first stillbirth. She did not scream. She did not weep in public. She only stopped speaking for 3 days. Her grandson, Sebastian, was born in the shadow of this loss. A prince of 2 dynasties. A boy whose every breath was a continuation of an empire built on fragility. Catherine held him in her arms. He was small, squirming, wrapped in silk and fear. She kissed his forehead, and then she gave him to the nursemaids, to the tutors, to the physicians, and she returned to prayer. Her role was not to mother anymore. It was to preserve, to remember. She had become a witness more than a woman. The halls of the palace felt colder after Joao's death. The light seemed dimmer. Portraits hung heavier. Every corner reminded her of what had been lost. She no longer entered the nursery wing. She avoided the music room where Joao had once played lute. She spent hours in the chapel, her fingers running over the beads of her rosary like they were the vertebrae of her own spine. Fragile, aching, trying to hold her upright. She was still queen, still consort, still part of the living court. But inside, she had joined the dead. And though the world moved on, though banquets were held, wars planned, marriages arranged, Catherine remained locked in a cycle she could neither escape nor repair. Her body had done what was asked of it, but her womb, through no fault of her own, had become a graveyard, not just for her children, but for a dynasty's illusions. No mother deserves such a title. No queen should be remembered only as a vessel of sorrow. But history often forgets what it cannot bear to face. And so, her story of blood, of birth, of fragile hope was shelved among footnotes, not because it lacked importance, but because it hurt too much to tell. The bells tolled across Lisbon, and this time they rang for a king. In 1557, John III died after years of declining health. His body swollen, his breath heavy, his mind dulled by age and sorrow. The official cause was said to be apoplexy, but those close to the court knew the king had been retreating for years, worn thin by loss, held upright only by duty and religion. His faith remained. His strength did not. Catherine stood beside his deathbed. She did not cry. She whispered a prayer. She crossed herself. Then she turned away, not as a grieving wife, but as a woman who understood that the next chapter demanded more endurance than mourning. She had buried children. She had buried dreams. Now she would bury a crown and be expected to wear it again. Her husband gone, her son dead, her grandson still a child. She, at 50, was the last adult with royal blood strong enough to hold the throne. And so, the queen became regent. It was not a coronation. It was an inheritance of anxiety. The council approved it, reluctantly. The nobles accepted it, cautiously. The church blessed it, but only in whispers. The truth was simple, though never spoken aloud. Catherine had the name, the lineage, the loyalty, but she did not have the favor of the court, and that favor mattered. Portugal, for all its splendor, had little patience for a woman who ruled from behind curtains. Her Spanish blood made her suspect. Her Habsburg name, though mighty, was viewed with unease, an echo of foreign domination, an ever-present fear that Portugal might be swallowed whole by the larger Iberian beast. She was regent by law, but not by love. Still, she did what she had always done. She governed quietly. No theatrics, no proclamations of greatness. She convened with counselors. She signed documents in tidy script. She managed the affairs of state with discipline honed over decades. And she watched Sebastian grow. The boy was fragile, yes, but not in body, in spirit. Too curious, too enchanted with stories of saints and soldiers, too captivated by crusades and glories long gone. He had the gaze of a dreamer, not the posture of a ruler. Catherine noticed this early, and she worried, but she said nothing. Instead, she arranged his household with care. She ensured his tutors were wise and loyal. She oversaw the finances of the court, monitored the nobility, strengthened ties with Castile, all while raising a child who was not hers to shape, but hers to protect. And she faced resistance, not from Sebastian, but from the men who surrounded him, advisors who smiled at her and undermined her, clerics who questioned her judgments behind locked doors, ambassadors who sent home letters filled with doubts, half-truths, and subtle warnings. She was too devout, they said, too rigid, too silent. Her presence unnerved them, not because she ruled badly, but because she ruled it all. A woman with power was never simply a leader. She was always a threat. And Catherine, with her stillness, her intellect, and her unshakable self-discipline, frightened those who expected pliability. She had no favorites, no scandals, no vulnerabilities that could be exploited. And so, they attacked the only thing they could, her silence. They said it masked manipulation, that behind her prayers were plots, that her loyalty to Spain might one day become treason. But she endured. She had endured worse. The palace, meanwhile, grew colder. Political factions split like cracks in marble. Some called for a new regent, someone younger, more Portuguese, more pliable. Others defended her, but not with passion, with necessity. Because whatever else she was, Catherine had never failed her station, and she never would. Her daily life was marked by ritual and restraint. She rose before dawn, attended Mass, read dispatches from Castile, reviewed accounts, walked the gardens slowly, as if counting the steps between yesterday and tomorrow. At night she sat alone beneath oil lamps, the shadows trembling against stone. Her letters were sparse, her handwriting precise. She rarely wrote of feelings. She wrote of stability, of grain shipments, of taxes, of alliances. Not once did she mention her loneliness. That kind of truth had no place in royal correspondence. Her quarters were austere, a crucifix above her bed, a portrait of John III on one wall, Prince João on the other. Their faces framed her solitude. She often spoke to them, not aloud, but in memory. She asked them questions. They never answered. Her power, though official, eroded slowly. She was replaced as regent in 1562 by Cardinal Henry, John III's younger brother. The transition was couched in terms of shared governance, a diplomatic maneuver to appease factions within the court, but everyone understood the meaning behind it. They no longer wanted her. Still, she remained. Not in exile, but in silence. She was given rooms, allowed to attend ceremonies, kept visible but only as a symbol. She no longer signed decrees. She no longer made decisions. Her presence was tolerated, her voice ignored. Yet she stayed, because leaving would mean surrender. And Catherine had never surrendered to grief, to gossip, or to the slow dismantling of her legacy. She lived like a statue, unmoved, polished by time, and increasingly invisible. And she watched. She watched Sebastian grow wild, untamed by caution or memory. She watched the kingdom forget the pain it once knew. She watched the church twist itself into politics. She watched men drunk on ambition, blind to consequence. And she waited. Not for revenge, not for restoration, but for the moment when everything she feared would come true. Because Catherine knew dynasties do not collapse in screams. They collapse in whispers, in overlooked signs, in the slow fading of those who remember. She was not a ruler of armies. She was a ruler of aftermaths, and she ruled it well. She had been queen, she had been mother, she had been regent. But now, she was something more painful, an ornament of the past. Though Catherine of Austria still lived within the stone walls of the Ribera Palace, her power had dissolved like ink in rain. Her name remained on official invitations, her presence still required at royal ceremonies. But these were courtesies, not acknowledgments of influence. She had been moved to the edges, carefully and without scandal, like a painting no longer admired but too historic to discard. And so, she faded. Not from existence, but from relevance. When Cardinal Henry took over the regency in 1562, the decision was framed as necessity, not rejection. He was, after all, a man, a brother of the late king, a prince of the church. His authority was seen as natural. Hers had always been questioned. Not for its results, she had ruled competently, but for the shape it took. A woman in control was an aberration. A woman who did not demand attention for her service was even more dangerous. They could not accuse her of failure, so they accused her of absence. She rules from the shadows, one noble wrote, not by command, but by withholding. It was a paradox she could never escape. If she spoke little, she was called secretive. If she spoke often, she would have been called overreaching. And if she remained silent, as she often did, then her silence was filled with the suspicions of others. So she embraced it, not as surrender, but as armor. She withdrew from the affairs of state, not out of weakness, but by deliberate choice. She had seen what power could do, how it corroded those who chased it, how it turned alliances to dust, how it consumed even kings in their own vanity. Power had never interested her for its privileges. It had always been a burden, a cross she carried out of obligation, not desire. And now, without that burden, she turned inward. Her days became measured rituals: prayer in the morning, reading in Latin and Castilian, long hours walking the palace gardens, her black robes trailing through the gravel like ink spilling across parchment. She tended to her own spiritual life with the same precision she once applied to government. She fasted. She read the Psalms aloud in her chambers. She embroidered religious symbols into linen, not for display, but for contemplation. Her apartments were quiet. No laughter echoed through her halls. No music played in her chambers. She allowed no frivolity. Visitors came in frequently and left quickly. Even her grandson, now old enough to ride horses and lead council meetings, rarely sought her counsel. Sebastian was growing into a figure both dazzling and disturbing. He believed he had been chosen for greatness. He dreamed of crusades, of holy wars in North Africa, of glory resurrected from medieval fantasies. Catherine had seen the way he looked at maps, not with curiosity, but with hunger. She had watched him speak to generals with a boy's excitement, and to priests with a martyr's conviction. And she had tried, quietly, without desperation, to warn him. She wrote letters, short, direct, firm. She reminded him of Portugal's fragility, of the losses their house had already suffered, of the weight a crown cannot see until it crushes the head beneath it. She spoke of prudence, of patience, of the quiet strength of rulers who endure rather than ignite. He answered her with politeness, but not conviction. He was kind, but he did not listen. And that, Catherine knew, was the most dangerous trait in a young king. Not cruelty, not weakness, but deafness to memory. She began to dream of fire, of armies burning in foreign sands, of ships wrecked on unfamiliar shores. In her visions, she saw boys without helmets, swords without purpose, banners soaked in salt and blood. She woke before dawn with her hands clenched. Sometimes she forgot where she was, but she told no one. Her fears were dismissed as age, her warnings labeled nostalgia. The court saw in her only a grandmother, a relic who had once ruled, yes, but now belonged to another time. And perhaps they were right, because Catherine no longer recognized the court she had once commanded. The nobles were younger, more ambitious, more restless. The churchmen spoke more of conquest than of compassion. The air buzzed with plans for glory, plans she knew were built on illusions. The Lisbon she walked through each day no longer held the scent of her youth. It was louder now, brighter, more impatient, and she, walking through it in her widow's black, seemed like a shadow no one could name. Her attendants aged with her. They knew her rhythms. They spoke little. They understood when she asked to be left alone. They brought her letters from Spain, which she read without expression. Occasionally she responded, always briefly, always formally. She did not write to her brother Charles before his abdication. She wrote to his son Philip II only when required. Even family had become distant, not in geography, but in spirit. They were all part of the same empire, yet their hearts beat in different palaces for different dreams. And Catherine, in her solitude, began to wonder whether she had ever belonged to any one place at all. Not to Spain, where she had been born but never truly known. Not to Portugal, where she had ruled but never been loved. Not even to the Habsburgs, whose legacy she had carried in her womb, but whose name now passed through her like a ghost through glass. She had been a queen. She had been a regent. She had been a mother. Now she was none of those things. Only a woman. Only a name. Only a silence that no longer frightened anyone. But perhaps that was its final power. To outlive, to endure, to remain when all else moved on. She no longer needed a throne. Her presence was its own quiet dominion. The boy she once rocked in her arms now rode through Lisbon in armor too heavy for his age. Sebastian, King of Portugal, grandson of Catherine of Austria, heir to 2 empires and a century of blood-soaked ambition, had become everything she feared, and nothing she could stop. He was tall for his age, sharp-eyed, restless. He spoke with the intensity of prophets, not monarchs. His voice rang with the certainty of someone who had never lost anything, who believed pain was something that happened only to others, and that glory was owed to those born in palaces. Catherine watched from balconies. She observed the young king address troops with trembling fervor. She listened to tales of his fascination with holy war, of dreams soaked in gold and martyrdom. She read the proclamations, his plans to conquer Morocco, to reclaim Christian lands, to make Lisbon not just a capital, but a gateway to divine redemption. She recognized the signs, not of greatness, of tragedy. She had seen them before. The same gleam that had danced in her brother Charles's eyes before war. The same recklessness that had taken her husband's breath in the Indies. The same denial that had shattered her son's lungs in youth. It was always the same. The belief that blood, noble and ancient, would protect a man from consequence. But Catherine knew better. She remembered how easily thrones became tombs. She had buried heirs who never ruled, watched dynasties vanish in nursery shadows. She had held infants in her arms only to feel them slip into silence. And now, she saw her legacy gallop into a storm while the court applauded. She tried to speak. She summoned him to her chambers more than once. The old queen, cloaked in black, her voice steady, her words chosen with the same care as a soldier picks weapons before battle. "You are not invincible," she told him. He smiled. "You carry a kingdom in your chest, not a shield." He nodded. "You will not return from war a hero. You will not return at all." He embraced her hand, kissed it, called her veneranda, the venerated one. But he did not listen. She saw it in his eyes, the distance, the courtesy, the condescension that youth offers to age when it believes wisdom has passed its use. She was not his queen. She was a painting, a prayer, a relic. And so, she withdrew again. Not in defeat, but in resignation. She walked the gardens longer. She sat in the chapel later. She wrote fewer letters. And when she did write, they were not warnings. They were records, observations. She began to document, not politics, but omens. On the 12th of July, 1578, Sebastian departed for North Africa. Catherine watched from behind a window as his ships pulled away from port, white sails billowing like shrouds. She did not wave. She did not cry. She simply watched, as one might watch a candle flicker in wind too strong for its flame to last. He was 24. The court rejoiced. The bishops blessed. The people cheered. Sebastian would win the cross for Christendom. He would drive back the Moors. He would return crowned, not by birth, but by conquest. But Catherine lit a candle that night and did not extinguish it for days. She prayed in silence, not for victory, for mercy. Because she knew as only someone who had lost could know, that the boy she once cradled would not come back. Not whole, not at all. On the 4th of August, the Battle of Alcácer Quibir was fought. 3 kings entered. None returned. Sebastian's army was slaughtered. Tens of thousands died in a sandstorm of steel and arrogance. No body was found. Only a legend that he vanished, that he would come again, that he was sleeping in some far-off cave until Portugal needed him. But Catherine needed no prophecy. She knew. She felt it in her bones before any messenger arrived. Before the panic reached Lisbon, before the bells rang not in mourning, but in confusion. She felt it in the silence that followed. The silence was different this time. It was not the hush of waiting. It was not the quiet of protocol. It was absence. Thick, undeniable, absolute. The dynasty had cracked. No heir, no king, no direction, no future that didn't come with foreign hands grasping at Portuguese borders. The court erupted in panic. Nobles turned on each other. Cardinals held emergency councils. Spain, under Philip II, watched like a patient vulture, waiting for an opening. And all the while, Catherine sat in the same chair, beneath the same crucifix, with the same expression carved into marble years before the first cry of her grandson. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not gloat. She did not scold. She mourned. And the mourning was not for Sebastian alone, but for every death that had led to his. every child she had buried, every voice she had lost, every warning unheeded, every generation that had mistaken silence for weakness. Catherine outlived the Avis line. She, who had once been queen, who had given her body to a kingdom, who had held the crown in her hands and been told to let it go, who had served without love and ruled without thanks, was now the last vessel of memory. They called her irrelevant. They called her old. But now, in the shattered ruin of a kingdom leaderless and broken, she was the only one who remembered how it had once stood. She did not seek power again. She no longer believed in it. Instead, she walked the cloisters as a widow, not just of a king, but of a dynasty. She tended her own relics. She mended old tapestries. She reread her husband's letters, her son's journal, her grandson's childhood drawings. She held a tiny shoe embroidered in silver thread, Sebastian's first, until the thread came loose in her hand. She whispered his name to no one. And when she slept, she dreamed not of glory, not of Spain, not of Portugal. She dreamed of wind, of ships, of a child running barefoot through palace gardens, unaware that fate had already chosen his grave. Catherine remained. But there was no court left to remember why. In the final months of her life, Lisbon no longer looked like the city she had first entered as a young bride in 1525. The streets were louder, the palace quieter. The names she once knew, gone, buried, exiled, or erased. Ministers had changed. The court's language had shifted. New alliances were whispered behind velvet curtains, and the generation now seated at the banquet tables had never seen her reign, never felt her presence when her voice mattered. They knew her as a shadow in the corridor, a name in old ledgers, a figure whose silence was mistaken for frailty. But Catherine still breathed. She moved through the palace as one might move through a dream, present but untouched. Her black gown swept the stone floors with a reverence no one else remembered. She greeted visitors with nods instead of words. She no longer corrected protocol mistakes. She no longer reminded scribes of lost records. She simply existed, like a candle no longer lit, but never blown out. There was no more throne to guard, no heir to prepare, no husband to advise, no sons to mourn. Even her brother was dead. Charles V, once emperor of half the world, had died 2 decades earlier in a monastery, his fingers wrapped around a crucifix, whispering sins too vast for even his confessor to hold. Philip II, his son, now ruled Spain with iron logic and religious fervor. He had claimed Portugal not long after Sebastian's disappearance, asserting his Habsburg right to the vacant crown. Catherine, in silence, had watched that too. She said nothing. Perhaps because she knew it would have happened anyway. Perhaps because she had stopped believing anyone was listening. In early 1578, Catherine fell ill. Slowly, without drama. Her appetite diminished, her hands trembled more than usual. Her sleep grew longer, deeper, filled with dreams she did not recount to her attendants. She received no healers, she allowed no leeches, she refused tonics. Her ladies tried to encourage her to eat. They pleaded with her to write to her nephew Philip, to ask for a confessor from Castile. She declined all of it. She did not need intervention. She needed permission to go, to end, to rest. On the 12th of February, 1578, Catherine of Austria died. No bells were rung across Lisbon. No public mourning was declared. No grand funeral procession walked through the streets. There was no velvet-draped carriage bearing her body. No mass attended by the entire court. no mourning dress enforced by decree. Her passing was not an event. It was a whisper. She was buried at the monastery of Geronimos, beside her husband, beneath stone cold and clean, marked by a name, a date, a title. Nothing more. There were no statues commissioned, no poems composed in her honor, no portraits painted in memory, no requiems written. Her death passed like a soft wind through open windows, acknowledged in official documents, footnoted in royal annals, but never spoken of with weight. Portugal had already moved on. Sebastian's death, or disappearance, had left the court in a frenzy of succession. The dynastic crisis absorbed all oxygen. Political survival became priority. Old queens did not warrant attention. Not when the throne stood vacant. Not when Spain loomed over the horizon. Not when a kingdom braced for annexation disguised as inheritance. Catherine's name was not slandered. It was not cursed. It was not insulted. It was forgotten. She had outlived relevance. Historians of her time did not write chapters about her. Chroniclers focused on her husband's voyages, her son's death, her grandson's crusade. She appeared only in relation to men, never as a woman who ruled, who raised, who endured. The annals listed her as consort, then regent, then widow, nothing more. The empire she had served with her body, her silence, her faith, had no room for the memory of her service. The Portugal she helped govern, the Spain she never truly returned to, the Holy Roman Empire whose blood ran through every vein of her descendants. None of them claimed her legacy with pride, because she had not rebelled, she had not failed, she had not betrayed. And those who do nothing wrong are the easiest to erase. She had no scandals, no revolutions, no tragedies the world could romanticize. Her story did not inspire ballads because it contained no disobedience. She obeyed until the end. And obedience, history has taught us, is quiet. The crown she once wore gathered dust in a chamber no one opened. The letters she wrote as regent, intelligent, detailed, precise, remained unread in archives, stored between folders of succession treaties and maritime reports. Her handwriting, elegant and firm, would fade before anyone deemed it worthy of study. There is something cruel in that, not to be hated, not to be vilified, but to be deleted. Her name, when spoken today, is often misremembered, confused with her niece, omitted from royal timelines, reduced to a line between monarchs. Catherine of Austria, married to her nephew, bore a sickly line, nothing more. But that line, however fragile, held the empire together for nearly a century. Her children did not survive, but her grandson bore the last flicker of Avis. Her womb extended the Habsburg claim. Her regency stabilized Portugal through a storm. Her silence filled the gaps that louder rulers left behind. She ruled, though no one called her ruler. She protected, though no one said protector. She endured, though history calls it nothing at all. And in the end, she left behind no heirs of memory. Only this, a gravestone, and a silence shaped like a woman who gave everything and asked for nothing, not even remembrance. They remembered the men she bore, but not the blood that shaped them. Catherine of Austria never held a sword, never commanded a fleet, never declared war. Yet every kingdom that rose or fractured from Iberia to the empire moved through her veins. She was the invisible conduit, the quiet hinge, the unmarked axis between dynasties that would eventually collide in union, splinter in resistance, and leave behind stories drenched in names. Names that were always male, always louder, always remembered. But she was the one who connected them. Without Catherine, there would have been no Sebastian. Without Sebastian, no crisis of succession. Without that crisis, no Iberian Union. In her, the lines of Castile, Aragon, Habsburg, and Avis met not in triumph, but in tension. She was the knot tied too tightly in the tapestry of empire, meant to secure, but destined to strain. And yet, while others broke under that strain, Catherine held. Even as her name dissolved from chronicles, even as the scribes favored kings over queens, action over stillness, war over motherhood, she remained present in absence. When Philip II of Spain claimed the Portuguese crown in 1580, he did so not only as a king with armies, but as the son of Charles V, the emperor who was Catherine's brother. It was not conquest that gave him claim. It was blood. It was inheritance passed through Catherine's son, João Manuel, through her grandson, Sebastian, and through every marriage she helped arrange, every alliance she held firm, every birth she carried to exhaustion. But Philip did not mention her. No one did. The union that followed, the Iberian Union that merged Spain and Portugal under one crown, did not list her as architect. It listed dead kings, papal decrees, family trees redrawn in haste. It cited treaties and lines of descent, but not the woman who had been the breath between two collapsing generations. She did not sign the final documents, but the ink, if tested, would carry her blood. Catherine had become something the world rarely names. A matriarch without myth, not revered, not scorned, simply misplaced. And yet, in the margins of Europe's greatest transformations, she can still be found. Not in the center, not in the grandeur, but in the quiet vas where real power often hides. She can be found in letters from ambassadors who feared her gaze, even as they dismissed her gender. She can be found in the diaries of priests who admired her discipline, though they dared not credit her decisions. She can be found in the patterns of succession, in the logic of marriages that crossed kingdoms, in the ink of dispensations approved not for romance, but for strategy. And she can be found in the features of those who followed. Noses shaped by Habsburg lines, chins carved by generations of incest, minds marked by the same fragilities that took her children too early. Her legacy is not a monument. It is a shadow cast across 5 decades of transition. What history calls the decline of Avis was, in truth, the end of Catherine's line. What historians describe as dynastic turbulence was, in truth, the slow erosion of a bloodline she tried, desperately, silently, devoutly, to preserve. She did not write manifestos. She did not leave behind volumes of philosophy or memoir. What she left behind was genetic, political, structural. She was a mother of monarchs, though few lived to rule. She was a stabilizer of succession, though her own power was stripped away. She was a queen regent whose decisions held back collapse long enough for a generation unworthy of her memory to step into her place and undo it all. And yet, no operas were written with her name in the title. No statues in Madrid or Lisbon commemorate her council. No popular tales recount her sacrifices. Instead, they call her simply Catherine of Austria, wife of John III, as though her identity began and ended in someone else's crown, as though her silence meant insignificance. But those who study closely, those who read not only what was recorded, but what was omitted, see her there, always there, quiet but unyielding, soft-spoken but essential. In the lineage of Philip III, who reigned over Spain and Portugal alike, Catherine's DNA runs. In the Iberian maps, redrawn by treaties signed long after her death, Catherine's marriages echo. In the crisis of the 17th century, when Europe fractured and war returned like a fever, Catherine's quiet foresight, her warnings unheeded, resurrect in hindsight. She had no empire of her own, but she held one together longer than anyone expected. By surviving, by enduring, by never becoming the scandal they feared. She was not Maria Tudor, burning enemies. She was not Elizabeth, shattering traditions. She was not Isabella, riding into battle. She was the opposite of spectacle. She was stillness. But it is stillness that holds the weight. Stillness that anchors. Stillness that remembers what others rush past. And in the silence she wore like mourning lace, Catherine of Austria became more than queen. She became the matriarch of the unremembered, the one who gave without asking, the one who stayed when others fled, the one who remained loyal to duty long after duty forgot to be loyal to her. Her name is faint now, a footnote in dynastic charts, a shadow in the genealogy of kings. But shadows, when followed, always lead back to light. And the light, when traced to its source, reveals a figure standing alone, not broken, not bitter, but waiting to be seen. She did everything right. She married as commanded. She bore children for an empire. She ruled without spectacle, obeyed without protest, and suffered without demand. She stood in the background while kings stumbled forward, while suns collapsed, while nations reconfigured themselves around her stillness. And never once did she beg the world to look back. Catherine of Austria, Queen of Portugal, was never scandalous, never defiant, never adored. And so, history left her behind. That is the paradox we rarely name, that obedience is rewarded with invisibility, that women who endure quietly are not honored for their discipline, but buried by it, that when a woman devotes her entire existence to holding something together, family, state, lineage, the world watches only the moments it falls apart. It documents the failure. It forgets the hands that kept the collapse at bay for decades. Catherine was not forgotten because she failed. She was forgotten because she succeeded too silently. That is perhaps the cruelest fate of all. Not to be erased by scandal or slander, but to be so effective in silence that memory has nothing dramatic to cling to. No rebellion, no explosion, no fall from grace. Only duty, only sacrifice, only the slow erosion of identity in service of survival. I think about her often, not because she ruled with fire, but because she ruled without it. Not because she broke the world, but because she held it together while it cracked beneath her feet. She is, to me, a symbol of all those, especially women, whose lives were spent holding history together while others were busy making noise. She reminds us that power doesn't always look like a crown or a sword. Sometimes it looks like a closed mouth a lowered gaze, a name written in the margins. And it raises a question I can't let go of. What happens to those who are loyal all their lives, but are remembered for nothing? Is loyalty only visible when betrayed? Does sacrifice matter if it leaves no echo? Or are there legacies, like Catherine's, that live not in monuments, but in the quiet structures of history that still stand because someone chose not to collapse? Catherine never demanded her story be told. But perhaps that's why it should be, because in the end, her silence was not weakness. It was survival. And survival, though not always celebrated, is often the most heroic act of all. She was not a martyr. She was not a saint. She was a woman, a queen. And that should have been enough.